on what's going on over there, especially as pertains to international law. So thank you, Mitt, for coming.
Thank you for inviting me, Ed.
Thanks.
It's a real pleasure to be here, and I'm really proud to be a senior fellow at the Stockdale Center for Ethical Leadership, which has been just an incredibly rewarding experience for me, really one of the most in my entire professional career. I want to thank Dr. Thomas for allowing me to play that role, as did his predecessor, Colonel Art Athens. So it's wonderful to be back here. I haven't been on the yard for quite a while, and I miss it. And so I feel like, if nothing else, I owe Dr. Thomas a report to account for my absence. So that's partly what I'm going to be doing today. I've been working on a project with the Ukraine Office of Prosecutor General. I'm going to provide a little bit of background. Much of this will be familiar, but just to give you some context of what we're doing, and then describe some of the activities that we've been engaged in over the course of the last year and a half. So as many of you know, almost exactly 2 years ago, 24 February 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine. There were Russian airstrikes and a ground invasion along a northern front from Belarus toward Kyiv, a northeastern advance toward Kharkiv, which is the second largest city in Russia, into southern Ukraine from Crimea, and a southeastern front into Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts, which comprise the Donbas area. Russian troops briefly went so far as to capture the Kyiv airport and penetrate into the suburbs about 8 miles from Kyiv before they were repelled. Kharkiv was the second largest city in Ukraine, with a population of about 1.5 million, a major cultural, scientific, industrial, educational, and transportation center. There was fierce fighting in the city from February 2022 until Ukraine regained it in May 2022, and the city has really been devastated. There's been massive damage to buildings, there's been a huge amount of displacement. The population is a fraction of what it once was. Basic services like water, sanitation, and so forth are still not fully functioning. In areas that have been occupied by Russia, that have been regained by Ukraine, there is also evidence of mass killing of civilians. In Bucha, not far from Kyiv, it's about a half an hour drive, which I've taken when I've been in Kyiv. 419 civilians were killed, many lined up with their hands bound behind their backs and shot at close range. In Izium, there were mass graves of 440 bodies, virtually all of them civilians. As the UN recently said, after nearly 2 years, there is no let-up in the death, destruction, forced displacement, and human suffering in Ukraine. So one response to this is, I should say also, there has been torture. There's evidence of torture of people, again, in areas in which Russia has controlled and is now relinquished. So much of what Russia has done constitute crimes under international law. Here is, for instance, the shelling of a maternity ward in Mariupol on the Sea of Azov, which goes into the Black Sea. The pregnant woman in that picture, unfortunately, did not survive. There have been persistent attacks on civilian infrastructure. The power grid, in particular, Russia has intensified those attacks over the winter months, hoping to cut off energy sources for heat, water, and sanitation. Russia is holding more than 6,000 children in at least 43 camps, at which the main goal is re-education into Russian political culture. So how do we respond to this? Obviously, there are military initiatives that I have not been involved in. But one way to respond to this is that, look, the vast bulk of these are crimes under international law, right? There are core crimes that are recognized throughout the world. And so a system of prosecuting those crimes is one way to respond to this, to hold people accountable, and to try to deter these sorts of things from happening in the future, right? The era of international criminal law was inaugurated with the Nuremberg trials, which I'm sure you've all heard of, right? Those were trials by the Allied powers of Axis power defendants after World War II, right? And they played a large role in helping develop the impetus for international criminal law, which has since been codified in many multilateral conventions. So the crime of aggression is one of the core crimes, which is, as you can see the definition there, it's basically, using force against another state that's not justified as self-defense, right? Now, President Putin argued that the invasion of Ukraine was for self-defense because of concern that NATO was expanding eastward. He also made a claim that it was necessary for humanitarian reasons because the Russian ethnic minority was being oppressed. There was really no one in the international community, other than his own advisors, who finds that persuasive. So there could be a prosecution of high-level officials who participated in planning the invasion for the crime of aggression. Right? Another crime is crimes against humanity, murder, extermination, enslavement, etc., when committed on a large scale. So not just sort of individual cases of these sorts of violent crimes, but systematically directed against an entire civilian population. Right? War crimes, which many of you probably are familiar with, under the Geneva Conventions, there are certain violations of the law of armed conflict that are characterized as grave breaches. And these are ones that states are required to criminalize, right? And try their own personnel for violations of them. And they basically focus, as you can see there, on deliberate attacks on civilians, including indiscriminate attacks. That is, an attack that doesn't use any sort of weapons that reasonably can be expected to discriminate between military and civilian objects, military and civilian personnel, right? Torture, inhumane treatment, right? Serious injury, destruction of property, and so forth. So these are war crimes under the Geneva Conventions. Finally, there is the crime of genocide under the Genocide Convention. Now, there's a little bit of confusion about this because it's natural for the average person when he or she sees large-scale sort of violence against a population to characterize that as genocide. But the Genocide Convention actually is very specific and rather narrow. It basically says that you are engaging in violence against a group because those people are members of that group, and your aim is to destroy them physically in whole or in part. The paradigm case of this, of course, is the Holocaust during World War II, inflicted by the Nazis. It's clear in Ukraine that Russia is engaged in what we might call cultural genocide. It's attempting to erase the idea of Ukraine as a sovereign nation, that there is an independent sovereign Ukrainian identity and culture and language, and substitute the idea that Ukraine is really, and always historically has been fundamentally, a part of Russia. So it's clearly trying to destroy Ukrainian identity, right? It's too early to say whether there is enough evidence that you could say that physical destruction, systematic physical destruction, is also a part of that. Ukraine itself has made that claim. In advising them, we've been very careful to say, it's possible, it's plausible. We're not at a point yet where we can say that there is evidence to support that. There could be, right? But we can't say yet. Now, when we're talking about prosecutions, the question is, all right, who is going to prosecute them and before what court? Again, we've had Nuremberg, we've had the trials in Tokyo after World War II, we've had international tribunals in Yugoslavia after the war in the Balkans, in Rwanda after the genocide there. All of those have been international tribunals established under the auspices of the United Nations. In recent years, the United Nations has created the International Criminal Court, which is meant to provide a permanent sort of tribunal to basically avoid the need for creating separate new tribunals each time there are atrocities, right? But the ICC, frankly, has fairly limited resources and capabilities. In addition, with respect to the crime of aggression, it does not have jurisdiction. Right? The ICC cannot prosecute members of a state that are not a party to their own statute, which is the statute that created the ICC. So there have been calls for a separate tribunal to be established to try the crime of aggression. And the Ukraine Office of Prosecutor General is cooperating, sharing evidence with the ICC with respect to various sorts of violations. But probably 95% of the prosecutions for Russian atrocities in this war are going to be conducted by the Ukraine Office of Prosecutor General. This is Prosecutor General Andrei Kostin, right? Ukraine has incorporated most international crimes that I described into its criminal code. So it can try those crimes under its own law, in its own courts, with the assistance of international experts, some of whom are working on the project with which I'm involved, advising them, right? And that's going to be important because much of what I spent last year doing was helping assist the Office of Prosecutor General and its prosecutors in becoming familiar with international law, international criminal law in particular. Ukraine has about 8,000 prosecutors. They're very experienced, they're very capable. They have a large number of investigators as well, right? But they don't have expertise in investigating war crimes. Right? Those are very different from ordinary domestic crimes of murder or assault and battery and so forth. So one of the things the project has been doing is providing legal advice to prosecutors on what kinds of conduct that they're seeing may be crimes under international law. We've been training investigators to conduct crime scene investigations, forensics. We have people who've worked in other international criminal tribunals who are advising them on the kind of evidence they need to look for indications that there have been mass violence as opposed to a series of individual attacks. There's also been a group I've been working with fairly closely of military analysis. These accompany investigators and prosecutors to the scene of attacks, and they identify Russian ordnance and then use a variety of different intelligence sources to try to identify the Russian military units responsible for an attack. All right? Then ideally, what they will do is try to gain information about which Russian commanders were in command of those units at the time of the attack, right? So this is an important component now that Ukraine has developed in order to be able to attribute these attacks to Russia and hold people accountable, particularly those at the higher level, other than simply foot soldiers. In addition, there's been tremendous environmental damage in Ukraine. And so our project has provided investigators and prosecutors with the skills to assemble evidence to support charges of environmental crimes. Right? We have helped the Prosecutor General put together a victim and witness protection and support center. Investigators and prosecutors often need people to testify who are victims of violence or witnesses, but those people are traumatized in many cases. And so they need to be counseled by people who have experience in dealing with those kind of people in order for them, first of all, simply to get on with their lives, but also in order for them to be willing to testify, because that can be an ordeal in itself. So all of these sorts of activities go to support the criminal prosecution, right, of those responsible for committing these atrocities that are international crimes during the course of this war. And that process is, of course, ongoing. Right? But a country that's been involved in conflict needs to pursue justice in ways that go beyond simply prosecutions. Ukraine currently has over 120,000 files of cases that could be potentially international crimes. It's going to be able to prosecute a small fraction of those, to be candid. Many of those may be against foot soldiers, the people who actually pulled the trigger. They will not have custody of those at higher levels who may be responsible for an operation. They'll have to make a choice of whether to try those people in what's called in absentia. If they're not there, they would have a counsel appointed for them who would represent them, right? The idea in that instance would be to create a record of culpability of these people. On the other hand, as you can imagine, there are serious concerns about what we would think of as due process and the legitimacy of these prosecutions. So, prosecutions are essential in ensuring that there is no impunity for commission of atrocities, but they may well not be enough for people in Ukraine to feel that justice has been done, right? Think of the kinds of losses, forms of suffering that the population in Ukraine, many of whom have suffered, right? Focusing on and responding to those is what's called holistic justice. This includes criminal justice, but it goes beyond it. And so the kinds of harms would include, for instance, loss of loved ones, right? Loss of limbs, physical disability, right? Suffering psychological trauma, having your homes destroyed, and then being displaced, often hundreds of miles away from your home into unfamiliar communities, right? Your children may have been killed, injured, or abducted and sent to Russia, right? If we think of justice as evening the scales, and if we think of the harm that someone has suffered on one side of the scales, will a person who suffered that kind of harm believe that prosecution is enough to balance the scales? In many, probably most cases, the people who have suffered those harms will not see prosecutions of the people who inflicted them, right? And so the question is, will Ukrainians believe that their government has responded in a meaningful way to the loss of their family members, their homes, their limbs, their ability to function, right? And particularly important, will they be committed to helping build a new democratic Ukraine out of the ashes of the war because they trust that the government has their interests at heart? Not surprisingly, research from a large number of conflict-affected areas indicates that the answer is no. Victims of conflict think of justice not simply in terms of prosecutions, but of justice as giving them a chance to repair the damage that they have suffered, right? If a government at least tries to do this, it can earn the trust of its citizens. And that can be important in enabling a country to emerge from conflict to build a stable society. This is especially important for Ukraine. It was not, by most measures, a fully robust democracy before the war. It was moving in that direction, particularly after the demonstrations in Maidan in 2014, right? But there were still vestiges, and people there will be candid in telling you, there were still vestiges of the Soviet system, there was still corruption. Reformers, nonetheless, are committed to establishing a genuine democracy governed by the rule of law, right? But in order to do that, people need to feel that they have a stake in the government, right? After not having one for many, many years, right? So holistic justice is important not simply to level the scales for a particular individual, right? It's actually crucial to enable Ukraine to make the transition, right, to a democratic country in which there is respect for the rule of law, right? And when I've talked to people in the Prosecutor General's office, they are keenly aware of that. And they're trying, even in the midst of war, to take steps to do that. So how can a government respond to victims in a way that makes them feel that justice, even if imperfectly, has been done? Well, one form is reparations. That could take a variety of different forms. Financial assistance, medical assistance, psychological assistance, assistance for education, housing that's been lost, social services. Those may be provided to individuals or even to communities to help them rebuild what they've lost, right? In Ukraine and internationally, there's been discussion of using frozen Russian government assets as a source of funding for reparations. So we have been helping Ukraine develop a domestic register of the losses that people have suffered to complement an international register that has been created in The Hague. Another thing that's incredibly important, which we might not appreciate, at first, is that people want a chance to tell their stories, right? They want documentation of what they've experienced. They want recognition and acknowledgement of it, not because they feel sorry for themselves, but because they feel it's important that the truth be told and that it be recorded. And this is particularly the case, in an era in which propaganda tries to deny this, right? There is a battle of narratives out there, increasingly in every war, right? And so people who know what has happened to them want the world to know what has happened to them. And so what are called truth and memory sorts of initiatives give victims a chance to tell their stories, to record them. Often museums are used as repositories of those stories. Memorials may commemorate the experience of persons during the war. A register of missing persons and assistance in trying to find them can be important for those whose loved ones have disappeared and whose fate is unknown. We know that Russia is holding numerous Ukrainians in occupied territories and preventing them from leaving. In some cases, they're actually physically detained. In other cases, they're simply prevented from leaving. Finding and returning to Ukraine children who have been taken from their parents and moved to Russia, where they may be made available for adoption by Russian parents. There is evidence that the adoption system is now, as one analyst put it to me, hiding Ukrainian children in plain sight. They are now available for adoption, right? So these are ways in which people feel if the government makes these sorts of efforts, in addition to prosecution, there is a greater chance they will feel that the government actually has responded to what they've experienced. Right? As the United Nations puts it, the international community must see transitional justice in a way that extends beyond courts and tribunals, that tries to balance a variety of goals. Right? Pursuit of accountability, which is criminal prosecution, truth, reparation, preservation of peace, building of democracy, and the rule of law. Right? So, don't get me wrong, criminal prosecution is an important form of justice. Right? Holding perpetrators accountable is important to send the message as Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, said, crime doesn't pay. But populations scarred by conflict, right, need additional forms of justice to feel that the scales have been leveled, at least to some extent. Right? I was recently speaking with a high-level Ukrainian prosecutor, and she said, we were given our independence in 1991, after the Soviet Union finally fell. With this war, we are earning it. You had your war of independence. This is our war of independence, right? So our work on seeking justice for Ukraine is a modest effort to try to help ensure that the population in that country will believe that the struggle has been worth it. Okay. So we have a few minutes for questions. I'll stop there. I'm happy to take questions that anyone might have. Provide further comments. Yes, sir, in the back.
Yes, sir. Midshipmen, third class McCullough. I have a question regarding the legal liability of other countries that are supporting Russia, such as like Iran sending like these very cheap drones that are being used in
Right.
attacks on.
Yeah, that's a good question. International law, by and large, doesn't provide liability for supplying assets, assistance to other countries. There have to be sort of more direct forms of intervention, right? Similarly, you mentioned Iran, of course, proxies are common. The law is fairly restrictive on when the actions of a proxy could be attributed to those of the sponsor, right? And so for the most part, that's not going to be, the kind of activity that could be subject to criminal prosecution. There certainly could be sanctions or other sorts of measures to try to deter that. Okay. So your hand was up earlier. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Third class Boateng.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously Ukraine has like a system in which that they're able to actually go and prosecute Russia and stuff like that. What about like places like Palestine, which might not have like official courts and like actual structures and systems in place on like a national recognized scale?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, to the extent that there's, the belief that's necessary, that, at least in the first instance, would fall within the judicial system in Gaza, let's say, but that system probably is not in a position to undertake that. It could fall within the system in Israel, but for various reasons that's probably not likely to happen. So the first instance, after that, the International Criminal Court would be a natural sort of venue, but Israel hasn't ratified the Rome Statute creating the court, so there could be some limited jurisdiction. In addition, as I said, the ICC is very constrained in the resources that it has, both in personnel and in terms of funds. Now it could be, it's funded by the United Nations, so there could be additional funds provided for the ICC for that purpose. Finally, it's possible, although less likely, that there could be a special court set up, as there was for Yugoslavia and for Rwanda. That's less likely because the idea of creating the ICC was that we don't need to do that in the future. We don't need to have these sort of one-off tribunals. We now have a permanent international tribunal, all right? So it would be tricky, I guess, is the bottom line of what I'm saying. Yes, sir.
Sean Midshipmen, third class Schmidt. You mentioned in your presentation that most of the prosecutions of Russians will come from the Ukraine office of the Prosecutor General.
Mm-hmm.
Can you explain a little bit about what that would actually look like, how the Ukraine office of the Prosecutor General is going to have the chance to try and prosecute Russian generals? Is the idea that Russia will give them over and sort of blame them after the...
Unlikely, unless maybe Putin loses power. That's the real challenge, I think. They have in custody a variety of what I'll call foot soldiers, people who have actually pulled the trigger pullers, right, and who perpetrated atrocities. And so they can try them in their courts, with their judges, assisted by international experts. Under Ukrainian law, which mirrors international law with respect to the crimes that I laid out earlier. Those higher up, though, are likely not going to be available. And so, Ukraine has to ask itself, well, is it worth trying these people in their absence, that they're not here, right, to establish a record that these people were in fact liable, right, that there were people in command, right, who made decisions that resulted in that trigger being pulled, right, or that missile being detonated, or what have you, this missile being fired, right? And that is a challenging political decision, because Ukraine is keenly aware that if it's conducting prosecutions in its own courts, the international community is going to wonder, well, how fair actually are these? These are trials being conducted by a country that's been invaded, whose population has been subject to massacre in some cases, all right? So, they are very concerned that their trials meet international standards, and that's where much of our project is trying to provide assistance. To try someone in absentia, as it's called, has occurred, but there are some questions about legitimacy that can create. Yes, ma'am.
Sir, Midshipman Broadcast Hiles, I was just wondering, you talked a little bit about using the frozen Russian funds to aid Ukraine. How would it be possible to use said money without harming the general civilian population of Russia? And is there a way to punish Russia without harming their civilians as well?
Well, that's a good question. It's a good question. Those are assets held by the Russian government, right? And much of, if those were available now for Russia, much of those would probably be going into the war effort, right? But there is always a trade-off and this is true with respect to sanctions as well, right? You want to create an incentive for a state to act appropriately, right? But by doing that, there is going to be some impact on the civilian population, right? And so that's a consideration to take into account. On the other hand, you figure, well, okay, there is suffering that Russians may endure, which perhaps, they are not liable for the atrocities committed in their name, but there are also Ukrainians who have suffered, all right? And so that, again, very much a political calculation. I've been struck by the extent to which politics enters into these kinds of decisions. Right.
There we go.
All right.
Okay. Ladies and
Perfect.
gentlemen, thank you for coming. Professor Regan will be here at